Welcome to the Department of Toxic Substances Control webinar on California's potential adoption of U.S. EPA standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. My name is Jessica Anderson, and I am the Public Participation Specialist with the department, which we will refer to as DTSC throughout this session. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. The webinar is scheduled from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And the purpose of today's webinar is to discuss the potential adoption of the U.S. EPA standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in California and to respond to your questions and comments. Slide 2, please. Okay, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a globe icon labeled Interpretation. Please click on the icon and choose your preferred language channel for the remainder of this presentation. We will now pause a few moments for the interpreter to make the announcement in Spanish for those that have just joined the webinar.
Muy buenos días. En la parte inferior de la pantalla va a haber un icono de globo terráqueo etiquetado como interpretación. Haga clic en el icono y elija su canal de idioma preferido para el resto de la presentación. Vamos a hacer una pausa para que puedan todos unirse al seminario web en español.
Thank you, Evelyn. Okay, so you are in a view and listen only role, and today we're going to be taking questions and comments through the Q&A feature and by phone. So please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and the toolbar to send any questions or comments. You can send them at any point throughout the webinar, and we will respond during the Q&A sessions mid-presentation as well as the end of the presentation. You can send as many as you'd like. We just ask that you send one at a time so that we're able to respond to each adequately. We will do our best to respond to the questions in the order that they are received, but please note that we will not be taking questions by chat function. For those joining by phone, please dial *9 to raise your hand and let us know you have a question or comment. You'll be prompted to unmute yourself. We also encourage you to send any questions or comments to retail@dtsc.ca.gov, and we'll do our best to reply via email to your questions. Lastly, please know that we're hosting this webinar from different locations, and we request that you bear with us if there's any lag time or longer pauses. We sincerely appreciate your patience, understanding, and cooperation in making this a successful meeting. So I will now go ahead and invite our Unit Chief, Jessica Twining, our Senior Environmental Scientist, to introduce our workshop team. Jessica, slide 3, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jessica Twining. I'm with DTSC. I want to thank all of you again for joining us today and providing your input on this rule. It's very helpful for us as we consider adoption in California. So I want to go through the introductions of the workshop panelists. So I will ask that the panelists please turn on their camera as I introduce you all. So we have Victoria Rouse-Jones with DTSC, myself, Jessica Twining with DTSC, Diana Peebler, also with DTSC, Liliana Callis with DTSC, and then we have Kristen Fitzgerald with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, which we will refer to as US EPA for this presentation. And then we have Brian Knizer with US EPA as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you again to everybody who's able to participate today for this workshop. We appreciate any input or comments anybody has. So we will go ahead and start the presentation. Just have a quick disclaimer. So any information in this presentation is for reference only and should not be used in place of actual regulations. So for today's agenda, we will be going over background on the Pharmaceuticals Rule. We'll provide an overview of current California requirements, as well as discuss regulatory requirements if California were to adopt them, as well as next steps. So the objectives of this workshop are to provide an overview of the Pharmaceuticals Rule, discuss DTSC's evaluation of the rule, as well as get your input on adoption in California, whether you are in support or in opposition. So please remember, this presentation is a high-level overview of the rule, and we will provide some background on the rule. So the Pharmaceuticals Rule was published in the Federal Register on February 22nd, 2019, and became effective
El
federally
21 de agosto de 2019.
2019. The rule added a new subpart P to 40 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 266, as well as amended other parts of the Code of Federal Regulations. The new subpart is a waste and sector-specific rule and applies to two industry sectors, which include healthcare facilities, pharmacies that generate, handle, accumulate, and dispose of pharmaceuticals, as well as pharmaceutical reverse distributors engaged in the management, handling, and disposal of prescription pharmaceuticals for facilitating or verifying monetary manufacturer credit. The rule applies to pharmaceuticals regulated as hazardous waste under the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as RCRA. So US EPA notes some objectives of the rule in the Federal Register to the rule. And one of the objectives is to increase compliance of healthcare facilities handling and disposing pharmaceuticals, which are RCRA hazardous waste, as well as facilitate management, handling, and disposal of prescription pharmaceuticals going through reverse distribution for evaluation for manufacturer credit. Another objective of the rule is to reduce pharmaceuticals being sewered through a sewer ban. Another objective is to also address the dual regulation of Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA controlled substances, as well as address US EPA's policy on reverse logistics. So US EPA adopted terminology that distinguishes between reverse distribution, which is for prescription pharmaceuticals, and reverse logistics, which is for non-prescription pharmaceuticals, as well as other unsold retail items. US EPA explains in the preamble to the rule its policy that non-prescription pharmaceuticals and non-pharmaceutical unsold retail items sent through reverse logistics are not solid waste at the retail store if they have a reasonable expectation of being used, reused, or reclaimed. If the reverse logistics center discards the item, it then becomes a solid waste, and the reverse logistics center is subject to applicable RCRA regulations. US EPA has identified the new subpart P as required for adoption in authorized states if elements of the state program are not either equivalent, more stringent, or broader in scope. So when a state adopts the subpart P, they have the option of retaining those more stringent elements. DTSC has evaluated the rule and determined that California's existing generator and treatment, storage, and disposal facilities.
Instalaciones de tratamiento, almacenamiento y eliminación en California son equivalentes, más estrictos o de alcance más.
Rule. US EPA has indicated that the rule must be adopted in whole and not in part, which DTSC is taking into consideration in its evaluation. Also important to note is that some aspects of how the rule would be applied in California may be different than how it would be applied on the federal level. And DTSC is continuing to evaluate the rule for adoption in California and seeking feedback either in support or opposition, which you may provide today. Before we discuss the rule, we will provide a high-level overview of California's current hazardous waste management requirements. In California, a generator must identify their waste and determine if it is hazardous. They must also count how much hazardous waste is generated in a calendar month to determine their generator category. They must notify DTSC of all hazardous waste activities, manage hazardous waste from the point of generation appropriately, and ship waste offsite as a hazardous waste. Generators are responsible for properly identifying all of their hazardous waste, and regulations set forth the criteria for the identification of waste as hazardous waste. DTSC only regulates pharmaceuticals that are RCRA hazardous waste. The California Department of Public Health, also known as CDPH, oversees the Medical Waste Management Act, which covers pharmaceutical waste not regulated under RCRA. California's hazardous waste generator requirements include requirements for manifest, pre-transport, such as packaging, marking, labeling, and accumulation of hazardous waste, as well as record keeping and reporting requirements. California has different generator categories determined by how much hazardous waste is generated in a calendar month. A small quantity generator generates less than 1,000 kilograms hazardous waste and or 1 kilogram of acutely or extremely hazardous waste per calendar month. A large quantity generator generates greater than or equal to 1,000 kilograms hazardous waste and or 1 kilogram of acutely or extremely hazardous waste per calendar month. An entity that treats, stores, or disposes of hazardous waste must be authorized by DTSC via a hazardous waste facility permit or other grant of authorization. So we will now go into an overview of the Pharmaceuticals Rule, as well as discuss some of the regulatory standards if California were to adopt these. So we will go over some applicable definitions. We'll go over applicability of the new Subpart P. We will go over healthcare facility standards, shipping standards, reverse distributor standards, the DEA conditional exemption, as well as new empty container standards. So first, we will go over some of the definitions, which would be added as a part of the rule. The first definition is for hazardous waste pharmaceutical, which is a pharmaceutical that is a solid waste and exhibits a RCRA characteristic or is RCRA listed. There are 3 types of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, which include non-creditable, potentially creditable, and evaluated. Non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are a prescription hazardous waste pharmaceutical that does not have a reasonable expectation to be eligible for manufacturer credit. Could also be a non-prescription hazardous waste pharmaceutical that does not have a reasonable expectation to be legitimately used, reused, or reclaimed. Some examples of these can include investigational drugs, free samples, as well as residues in containers. The next definition is for potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical, which is a prescription hazardous waste pharmaceutical that has a reasonable expectation to receive manufacturer credit and is in original manufacturer packaging, except for recalls, is undispensed and is unexpired or less than 1 year past expiration date. US EPA doesn't define reasonable expectation, but they do state their intent is to prevent hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are clearly ineligible for credit, thus these additional criteria. The next definition is for evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceutical, which is a prescription hazardous waste pharmaceutical that has been evaluated by a reverse distributor and will not be sent to another reverse distributor for further evaluation or verification of manufacturer credit. The next definition is for healthcare facility, which includes, but is not limited to, wholesale distributors, third-party logistics providers, military medical logistics, hospitals, ambulatory surgical centers, health clinics, optical and dental providers, ambulance services, pharmacies, including mail order pharmacies, long-term care facilities, veterinary clinics and hospitals, and chiropractors. It does not include pharmaceutical manufacturers, reverse distributors, and reverse logistics centers. So the definition for reverse distributor is any person that receives and accumulates prescription pharmaceuticals that are potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals for the purpose of facilitating or verifying manufacturer credit. So any person, including for distributors, third-party logistics providers, and pharmaceutical manufacturers that process prescription pharmaceuticals for the facilitation or verification of manufacturer credit is considered a reverse distributor. And EPA notes in the Federal Register to the rule that reverse distributors receive shipments of unused expired prescription pharmaceuticals from healthcare facilities. And on behalf of manufacturers, facilitate the process of monetarily crediting healthcare facilities. The prescription pharmaceuticals are not reused nor resold and are discarded. US EPA has developed a regulatory system that is designed with existing business practices in mind. Next, we will go over applicability for Subpart P. Subpart P is required for most healthcare facilities and is required for all reverse distributors. Healthcare facilities that generate above 1 kilogram of acute hazardous waste or 100 kilograms of non-acute hazardous waste are required to comply with the new Subpart P standards. Subpart P does not apply to over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, dietary supplements, or homeopathic drugs that are not a solid waste, if they have a reasonable expectation of being legitimately used, reused, or reclaimed. Next, Subpart P adds standards for healthcare facilities managing hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Under current California regulations, facilities that would meet the federal definition of a healthcare facility are currently regulated as hazardous waste generators. And they are required to manage all RCRA hazardous waste pharmaceuticals under existing California hazardous waste generator standards. If California were to adopt the requirements of Subpart P, All healthcare facilities operating under the rule would be required to submit a one-time notification on the EPA Form 8712 site identification form that they are operating under the new subpart. There are no generator categories under Subpart P with respect to pharmaceuticals managed under Subpart P. And healthcare facilities are not subject to biennial reporting requirements for any pharmaceuticals managed under Subpart P. A healthcare facility is required to conduct a hazardous waste determination for all pharmaceuticals, unless they choose to manage their non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals as hazardous waste. Facilities may accumulate hazardous and non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in the same container. And all personnel that manage non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals must be familiar with proper waste handling and emergency procedures relevant to their responsibilities. Additional standards for healthcare facilities managing non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals include that they must label accumulation containers with the words hazardous waste pharmaceuticals.
Con las palabras de las farmacéuticas de los desechos peligrosos, en ningún se requieren que se pueden incluir y las instalaciones de cuidado de salud se puede acumular por un año o menos o también del estado.
Additionally, they must comply with land disposal restrictions, but they are not required to identify hazardous waste codes on the land disposal restrictions notification. There are also additional record-keeping requirements which are specified in Subpart P. They must also immediately contain all spills of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and manage the spill cleanup materials as non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. There are also exception reporting requirements in the event that a healthcare facility does not receive a signed copy of a manifest from a TSDF. Standards for healthcare facilities managing potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals include that there are no labeling, no container standards, and no accumulation time limit. And reverse distribution is only to be utilized for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that have a reasonable expectation to be eligible for a manufacturer credit.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. We now will take a break for a 15-minute Q&A to review any questions or comments. So once again, if you have a question or comment, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. We will respond to them in the order that we receive them, and we will not be using the chat function. For those of you joining by phone, go ahead and press *9 to raise your hand to let us know you have a question or comment, and you will be prompted to unmute yourself. Once again, we ask that you only ask one question or comment at a time so everyone has an opportunity to get their question or comment responded to. So we have a couple of questions in here. First one says, who determines reasonable expectations?
Well, I think as we were saying, it's based on whether, does it meet those criteria that are specified in the regulations? I guess EPA could also speak on that better if somebody from EPA wants to come in as well.
Sure. It's a standard that's been in the kind of guidance for a long time. It's not a new standard, this reasonable expectation. That's why we used it. So, I mean, I think there's kind of a new attention to it. So people are a little nervous about what it means, but it's a standard that's been out there since the very first times we started talking about reverse distribution. That said, I guess it ultimately falls to the generator of the waste to figure out if there's a reasonable expectation. Of course, that can also be questioned by any inspector that would come by. But the idea is that if you absolutely know that it shouldn't go to reverse distribution because it's either not going to get credit or, it's not even a pharmaceutical, then it shouldn't be going to reverse distribution.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. Okay. Next question says, where do medications on the NIOSH list that are not RCRA fall?
Medications which are not RCRA, hazardous waste, DTSC has no authority over any pharmaceuticals which are not RCRA hazardous waste.
Okay, and the second part of that question also says...
I'm sorry, can I chime in on that one? Sorry. So Victoria's absolutely right. We don't have jurisdiction over them if they're not hazardous waste, but we do have a recommendation about what to do with them. Federally, we recommend that NIOSH hazardous drugs be managed as hazardous waste. Not all of them necessarily, and they're in the NIOSH is in the midst of updating their hazardous drug list. So we're kind of between two different lists of NIOSH hazardous drugs. There's the 2016 list, which is the most recent final list. There's a 2020 list that was proposed. And so we have if you're familiar with the 10-step blueprint, we just put out an update just last month of the 10-step blueprint. And if you just Google 10-step blueprint, find the 2022 update to the 10-step blueprint, there's a whole section about how we recommend one manages the NIOSH hazardous drugs. But Victoria's right. If they're not hazardous, we don't actually have regulatory authority over them, but we do have recommendations in the document about how to manage them.
Okay, so the second part of that question says, do we just treat the regular pharmaceuticals waste even if it's is chemo or has hormonal effects?
I don't understand the question. Do you treat?
It's related to the NIOSH list again. So yeah, I would say take a look at what's in the 10-step blueprint.
Okay, thank you. Next question says, can aerosols and tablets be in the same container also? We are told they need to be separated because they have different properties.
There are DOT considerations for segregating those. And again, I would refer you to the 10-step blueprint for that.
All right, thank you. Next question. Oh, did you have something more, Victoria?
No, thank you.
Okay, next question says, is there a practical list of pharmaceutical medications that are RCRA?
I believe EPA may have a list, right? There isn't a complete list, but there are some guidance documents that EPA has put out.
Yeah, we had a wiki at one point where we hosted the wiki and people contributed to that. And the site that we hosted that on doesn't host wikis anymore. So we grabbed the document and we now have an archived version of that on our website. But I would say there are several free, sources of information out on the web. I would not say any of them are 100% complete or thorough. So I think that you could use those sources as a start, but I wouldn't necessarily use them as a as the end of your hazardous waste determinations. But again, we recommend, we can't require because some of them aren't hazardous, but we generally recommend in the preamble to our final rule that to avoid having to know which ones are hazardous and which ones aren't, that you just manage all your pharmaceuticals as hazardous waste, and then you won't have that problem of having to figure it out what's hazardous and what's not.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question says, how is reasonable expectation determined and how is this enforceable?
Was that question? I think that question was already answered. That was the
part of it. So the reasonable expectation was the question. This one is asking how it's enforceable as well.
I don't understand. What do you mean, how is it enforceable?
Well, I would say, if an inspector comes on site and they find that you're continually sending things that you never get credit for, and you're sending them anyway, right? That's That's how it would get enforced. There's also, if you are sending things to a reverse distributor that we refer to as, sorry, I'm spacing on the terminology. If you're sending stuff that shouldn't go to a reverse distributor, they're supposed to send a notice back to you and to the region or the state saying that they're getting inappropriate materials. So that's kind of another method of, not exactly enforcement, but of feedback to tell healthcare facilities they really shouldn't be sending that stuff to a reverse distributor.
Great.
Unauthorized waste. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Kristen and Victoria. Next question says, are there any requirements regarding documenting the credit worthiness of waste?
I guess if EPA could respond to that.
Well, what's typically done is the reverse distributor. So I don't know if they're referring to the reverse distributor or the healthcare facility, but what's typically done is the reverse distributor will provide, a list of things back to the healthcare facility, that got credit and how much credit. And so that can kind of help in an enforcement or inspection situation where a healthcare facility, says, well, they keep sending the same thing to reverse distributor and it's never getting credit. And there's that feedback mechanism from the reverse distributor. That's not in the regulations. That's just common business practice.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Next one is a comment. It says hazardous waste mixture rule will apply here. And thank you for your comment. We'll go ahead and record those as part of our comments on this. Moving on, we will go on to the next question that asks, is there a published list by US EPA or DTSC RCRA pharmaceuticals that are considered RCRA, or any new TCLP data on common pharmaceuticals?
We just have the archive list of, what was contributed to the wiki, but we have a large disclaimer on there that says, the hazardous waste determination is the generator's responsibility, and we did not verify this information. So we just provided the platform for other people to contribute the information that's not our information, and we didn't verify it. That's partly, again, why we recommend, if you don't want to hire somebody to help you make those hazardous waste determinations, we recommend that you just manage all your pharmaceuticals hazardous waste, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Okay, thank you. So we got a couple more questions in our 15-minute break here. The next one says, just want to confirm, will over-the-counter pharmaceuticals be considered hazardous waste?
Well, that would depend on whether they are a RCRA hazardous waste. So even if they're over-the-counter pharmaceutical, if they're a RCRA hazardous waste, they could still be a hazardous waste.
Yeah, it's just if Victoria's absolutely right, they can definitely, meet a characteristic in particular of a hazardous waste. The difference with OTCs is that if they have a reasonable expectation of use, reuse, reclamation, and they're going through reverse logistics, that they wouldn't be considered solid waste going through reverse logistics, which is different than going through reverse distribution. They are considered waste.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Looks like the next question says, might the manufacturer have motivation or pressure to issue credit in spite of knowing that pharmaceuticals will likely be disposed of?
Yeah, I guess that's exactly the point, is that things going to reverse distribution are all disposed of, and that's why we consider them waste at the healthcare facility now as part of this Subpart P rulemaking. The ones, anything going to reverse distributor basically will get disposed of, whether or not they actually get credit.
Okay, thank you. Next one says, isn't managing all pharma waste as hazardous waste going against RCRA LQG generator requirements to minimize source reduction?
Well, this rule is in Part 266, not in 262, and so if you're operating under Subpart P, there are no generator categories for pharmaceuticals with respect to pharmaceuticals. So that was kind of one of the incentives we built in, to help folks not have to make that decision about what's hazardous and what's not. Like, if you do that, the danger is that you'll up your generator category and then you'll have more regulations. And so that's a disincentive to overmanage non-hazardous pharmaceuticals, right? So we basically took away that disincentive by saying, well, look, once you're in Subpart P, you're regulated the same regardless. So go ahead and overmanage, and you don't have to worry about bumping up in generator category.
Okay. Next question says, for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals commingled with controlled substances, how would generators satisfy dual regulations?
So we will get to that in the next part of the presentation. Maybe you want to save that question until later if it's not answered.
Okay. I can move on to the next one then. It says, what if your first distributor accepts RCRA and non-RCRA farm, but manages it for you and sends you manifest to the healthcare facility?
I'm not sure I followed that.
One more time. It says, what if your first distributor accepts RCRA and non-RCRA farm, but manages it for you and sends you manifest to the healthcare facility?
Once the reverse distributor receives the pharmaceuticals, the hazardous ones have to go to a TSDF following that for treatment and then disposal. They can't manifest them back to the healthcare facility.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So we're going to move on to the next part of our presentation. So Victoria, if you want to pick up the next slide.
Oh, yes. And one thing I just wanted to note is, yes, we appreciate all the questions, which is very good. Everybody has questions. But if anybody also has comments just to whether they think we should adopt a rule or whether there's any issues with adoption, we appreciate those as well. And I will go ahead and go on to the next part.
Yeah, and then just as a disclaimer, we do have some additional questions in here. We'll hold those for the remaining Q&A at the end of the presentation, just to make sure that we have enough time for the rest of the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so we'll continue on with for additional standards for shipments of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And we will discuss shipments of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So a manifest and a hazardous waste transporter is required for non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals shipped by healthcare facilities, as well as evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals shipped by reverse distributors. Specifically for shipments of non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, healthcare facilities must use either the FARMS code or PHRM code on the manifest. And other hazardous waste codes are allowed but not required. So for shipments of potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, healthcare facilities and reverse distributors may send their potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical to a reverse distributor for evaluation of manufacturer credit before it goes for disposal. For potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, no manifest and hazardous waste transporter is required, and a healthcare facility may use a common carrier such as UPS, the United States Postal Service, or FedEx. And the shipper must receive delivery confirmation within 35 days from the date the shipment was sent. And an electronic delivery confirmation would typically be sufficient for that. If no confirmation is received, the shipper must contact the carrier and the intended recipient, which is the reverse distributor, to report that the delivery confirmation was not received, as well as to determine the status of the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical. Subpart P specifies what requirements reverse distributors must comply with when managing either potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Currently in California, an entity that would meet the definition or the federal definition of a reverse distributor can only accept hazardous waste if authorized by DTSC via a hazardous waste facility permit or other grant of authorization. Under Subpart P, a reverse distributor is a new type of hazardous waste management facility that can accept hazardous waste pharmaceuticals from off-site. Reverse distributors are not required to have a RCRA storage permit or interim status. And if a reverse distributor receives a waste it is not authorized for, it must submit an unauthorized waste report. So examples of this can include biohazard, non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste, or other healthcare waste. Pharmaceuticals managed under Subpart P do not count toward generator status. And a reverse distributor must also send a one-time notification on the EPA Form 8712 or Site Identification Form that it is a reverse distributor operating under Subpart P. Reverse distributors must also maintain security at the facility, such as through a surveillance system,
Sistema de vigilancia, cercas, acceso con tarjeta de acceso y deben preparar un plan de contingencia.
Reverse distributors must inventory and evaluate pharmaceuticals within 30 calendar days of the waste arriving. To establish whether it is destined for another reverse distributor for further evaluation or verification of manufacturer credit, or whether it is destined for a permitted or interim status TSDF. They may accumulate potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals on site for 180 calendar days or less. And the 180 calendar days starts after the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical has been evaluated. And unexpired pharmaceuticals are subject to this limit after expiration. So a reverse distributor that receives a potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical from another reverse distributor must send those to a reverse distributor that is a pharmaceutical manufacturer. So a potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical may only be shipped to 3 reverse distributors before it must be sent to a permitted treatment, storage, or disposal facility. Once evaluated, a pharmaceutical manufacturer must comply with evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals standards. A reverse distributor managing evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals must have an on-site accumulation area and must conduct weekly inspections. They must also comply with personnel training requirements, which are specified in the subpart. Containers must be in good condition and managed to prevent leaks, and containers must be labeled with the words hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. The reverse distributor must comply with shipping requirements and must manifest the waste and use a hazardous waste transporter. They must also list hazardous waste codes on the container prior to shipment and on the manifest. And the reverse distributor must report on a biennial report. Next, we will go into the Drug Enforcement Agency conditional exemption or Drug Enforcement Agency controlled substances conditional exemption. So Subpart P includes 2 new conditional exemptions from hazardous waste requirements for RCRA hazardous waste that are also Drug Enforcement Agency controlled substances, as well as household waste pharmaceuticals collected in a DEA authorized collection receptacle. In order to meet the conditional exemption, the RCRA controlled substance must not be sewered, must be managed in compliance with DEA regulations of tracking, shipping, and record-keeping requirements, and must be destroyed by a method that the DEA has publicly deemed in writing to meet its non-retrievable standard, or combusted at one of the types of permitted facilities specified in subpart P. The next amendment we will go over is amendments to empty container standards. So the new subpart includes new empty container standards for 4 types of containers which are commonly used in a healthcare setting, which include stock dispensing bottles, syringes, IV bags, and other containers. The standards amend how containers of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are determined RCRA empty, and how the residues are not regulated as hazardous waste. These standards apply to all generators, not just healthcare facilities. So for the first type of container we will go over is stock dispensing bottles, which are either 1 liter or 10,000 pills, and unit dose containers. So they are considered empty provided all pharmaceuticals have been removed from the bottle or container using the practices commonly employed to remove materials from that type of container. The next empty container standard is for syringes, and they are considered empty and the residues are not regulated as hazardous waste provided the contents have been removed by fully depressing the plunger of the syringe. If the syringe is not empty, the syringe must be managed and disposed of as a non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical. The next standard is for intravenous bags or IV bags, and they are considered empty and the residues are not regulated as hazardous waste if pharmaceuticals have been fully administered to a patient. If they are not empty and the IV bag held a non-acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical, it is considered RCRA empty as defined in federal regulations if all waste have been removed that can be removed using the practices commonly employed to remove materials from that type of container, and no more than 1 inch of residue remains on the bottom of the container, or no more than 3% remains in the container. If the IV bag held an acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical, the IV bag must be managed and disposed of as a non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical under subpart P. And last, we have the last type of hazardous waste pharmaceutical container is other containers, which can include residues in inhalers, aerosol cans, nebulizers, tubes and ointments, gels, or creams. So if the device or container held a non-acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical, it is considered empty if it is RCRA empty as defined in federal regulation, which is the same for IV bags. But this also includes that if the container held a hazardous waste that is a compressed gas, it is empty when pressure in the container approaches atmospheric. Now, if the container held an acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical, the residue and container must be managed as non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals under subpart P and cannot be rendered RCRA empty. So triple rinsing is not allowed or required. And that concludes the part of the presentation on regulatory standards if California were to adopt a rule. We are projecting the following timeline. We will continue accepting feedback either in support or opposition and project to have a decision on adoption by winter 2023. So if DTSC does decide to pursue adoption, we project the regulations will go into effect by the end of summer 2023. Now, you may provide feedback either today or provide via email. The email is retail@dtsc.ca.gov. And we ask that you please provide your feedback by December 9th, 2022. So thank you very much for attending, and we appreciate any feedback that you can provide us.
Okay, it looks like we are back at the question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So once again, please go ahead and click on the toolbar and click the Q&A button for any Q&A or any questions or comments that you might have. And then for anyone joining by phone, if you have a question, please press *9 to raise your hand and let us know you have a question. So let's go back to that one question from the previous session. It says, for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals commingled with controlled substances, how would generators satisfy dual regulations?
Oh, could EPA answer this question?
Sure. So for the handful or so of pharmaceuticals that are both DEA controlled substances and hazardous waste, we removed the dual regulation with the conditional exemption. So with a few conditions, you do not have to follow RCRA, you only have to follow the DEA regulations. We're basically deferring to the DEA regulations for those handful of pharmaceuticals that are both. The conditions Victoria mentioned in her slide, no sewering, they have to be managed in compliance with the DEA regulations, of course, because we're deferring to the DEA regulations. And they have to be destroyed by incineration. But we allow incineration, permitted incineration. This is other than hazardous waste incineration. It can include municipal solid waste incinerators, hospital medical infectious waste incinerators, or commercial industrial solid waste incinerators. And if one day, this hasn't happened yet, but if one day DEA deems another method, they have to deem it in writing. If they deem another method in writing to meet the non-retrievable standard, then you'd be able to use that destruction method as well in order to meet the conditional exemption.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Next question says, how does subpart P impact a facility's generator status?
So as we discussed, there are no generator categories under subpart P. So a healthcare facility, any pharmaceuticals which are managed under subpart P do not count toward generator category or status.
Okay, thank you. Next one says, is there a reason why US EPA will not publish a list?
Well, the regulations require that to be the generator's responsibility. We do try to point people, to publicly available lists, but I would not recommend relying solely on those.
Okay. Next one says, is it true that the RD are reporting generators that send non-creditable RCRA farms to EPA?
Yeah, that's a requirement built into the reverse distributor regulations that I mentioned earlier, the unauthorized waste reports. So if a healthcare facility is sending things that have never gotten credit or don't meet the kind of criteria for potentially creditable, or maybe even aren't even pharmaceuticals at all, like maybe medical waste is getting stuck in the box that's going to a reverse distributor, then the reverse distributors needs to do an unauthorized waste report to the state and or region, and they also send to the healthcare facility, so the healthcare facility is aware of their practices that need to be corrected.
Thank you so much. We have a next question here. It says, could you please explain again the accumulation storage time for hazardous waste RCRA pharmaceutical?
For the generators, that's up to 1 year or less without a permit or interim status.
It doesn't specify generators. It just asks to explain the accumulation storage time.
Right. So is it for the reverse distributors or the generator?
Dana, can you go ahead and clarify that in our Q&A, and we'll come back to this one? Okay, next one says, can you provide the RCRA definition of pharmaceuticals? I'm getting a little confused when DTSC is saying only RCRA regulated pharmaceuticals are a hazardous waste, but most or all over-the-counter drugs are considered California or non-RCRA hazardous waste.
DTSC only RCRA regulated. So DTSC only regulates pharmaceuticals, which are also RCRA hazardous waste. So it either needs to meet the RCRA either criteria or it needs to be RCRA listed. Whether it's over-the-counter drug doesn't have anything to do with that.
Exactly. Yeah, there are a lot of over-the-counter drugs that meet the RCRA definition of hazardous waste.
Okay, thank you. Next question says, will reports or notifications be required if confirmation is not received within 35 days of shipment?
Oh, I think we discussed that the generator is required to try to determine where the waste is at and to contact whatever company they use to ship it to determine the location.
It's the same as the generator regulations, yeah.
And there's it's the exception reporting requirement as well.
Right.
Okay. Next question says, this is a comment. It says, we need something in the regulations that will require facilities to provide receipts for their reverse distribution logistics to determine if they are managing their hazardous waste properly. Okay, so thank you for that comment. We'll go ahead and record that one as well. Moving on to the next question. Looks like someone's asking for the recording to be available later. We
will post the recording on our website.
So we have a DTSC Green channel on YouTube, and we can go ahead and distribute those links to all of the registrants to this. So if you are not registered for this webinar, please go ahead and email retail@dtsc.ca.gov, and we'll go ahead and forward you the link for that. Otherwise, you can keep an eye out on our YouTube channel within the next coming weeks. Okay. Next question says, just to be clear, currently in California, RCRA Farm may not be sent to reverse distributor, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And the second part of that?
Well, that is unless they are authorized or permitted to receive it.
Oh, good. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, so the next part says, is there a list of reverse distributors with addresses that are operating in California?
We're actually not aware of any list. There may be, but we're just not aware of it. If anybody knows if there is, we would appreciate that as well.
So DEAs will sometimes publish a list of their reverse distributors, and any reverse distributor under our regulations would also have to be a DEA reverse distributor because they'd have the control, well, assuming they have any controlled substances on site, they would have to be a registrant with DEA. So the best bet is to try and Google that list. DEA doesn't necessarily post it on their website, but other people have posted the list on online.
Okay. Next question says, I appreciate it's a comment, excuse me. It says, I appreciate that there is a threshold in waste generation for this rule for when this rule applies.
Okay.
So thank you. Thank you for that comment. We'll go ahead and record that one as well. So we do have someone with their hand raised. So Lindsay, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to make verbal comments. This is Lindsay Goldhorn here on behalf of the California Retailers Association. First, just want to thank everyone at DTSC for all of your work so far on conforming California regulations to the farm rule with respect to worker and empty container provisions. We really appreciate the work that you've done with us and all the conversations that we've had. Also want to express that CRA really appreciates today's workshop and the chance to provide comments on the farm rule and be a resource to DTSC as you evaluate the potential adoption of the rule in California. California's retail pharmacies have been on the front lines of California's response to the pandemic and continue to be one of the most easily reachable healthcare access points for Californians. So we are in strong support of the adoption of the farm rule because we think it will promote efficient and environmentally sound waste management standards for pharmaceutical products that are better tailored to retail operations and ultimately better for California patients. I want to note that, and as you probably know, almost all states in the United States have adopted or are in the process of adopting the pharmaceutical rule. And in these states, we haven't encountered any problems where many of our members are utilizing Subpart P. So I think it's important to note that, and also note that the tracking and management standards in Subpart P were actually developed primarily from EPA's field work with stakeholders in California. And I'll try to be quick, diving into a little more detail on the specific reasons why we are supportive of adoption of Subpart P in California. It promotes the return of potentially credible pharmaceuticals to a reverse distribution facility that is heavily regulated and subject to EPA registration, as well as inventory and delivery confirmation, evaluation and accumulation time limits, and reporting and record keeping requirements. So this minimizes the points of control and the risk of diversion and aligns financial incentives with what we think are DTSC's priorities. In addition, adoption of Subpart P would also align California's regulation of RCRA hazardous waste pharmaceuticals with AB 1442, a law that authorized reverse distribution of non-RCRA hazardous pharmaceuticals 10 years ago. And it will be beneficial in California and assist in the creation of a uniform national system, which is helpful because reverse distribution involves interstate shipments. And the last thing I want to raise, based on work in California, the rule also clarifies when a prescription drug is potentially creditable and when it is not. This clarity helps both the retailers and regulators. Allowing retailers to use reverse distribution for RCRA regulated pharmaceuticals means credit dollars flow from drug companies back to the California economy. And without this credit, retailers either have to absorb losses from unsold products or unfortunately pass those costs on to consumers. So those are just a few reasons why we support adoption of the farm rule in California. Again, thank you for all of your work on this. Thank you for the workshop today and appreciate being able to provide comments.
Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, so with that, we'll move on with some of our Q&A here. It says, please describe the opportunity for questions and comments on this proposed rule after the workshop.
So as I said before, we asked that you either you can send an email to retail at dtsc.ca.gov with any questions or comments that you would like to provide. You can also just request a meeting or just give us a call if you want to provide any comments as well. But the best thing is to go ahead and email retail at dtsc.ca.gov. And we ask that you do it within a month time span so that we can get a better idea, because we use your comments on any issues that you may see with the rule, anything that you see that may be beneficial in our evaluation. So any comments that anybody can provide, we appreciate that.
All right, thank you, Victoria. So we have another question here that says, question for the EPA. How many states have adopted Subpart P, and how has the implementation of the rule been going? I think that would be a question for Kristen. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so Brian's helping me out here. We have a map where we track that, but I haven't counted them recently. So I think Brian's kind of trying to do a quick scan, and maybe we can drop the link in the Q&A or the chat for people to see later.
We did drop the link in the answered questions.
Oh, great.
But there's a second part of that question.
How is the implementation?
Yeah, how has the implementation of the rule been going?
Well, as the states come online, sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Is that?
You're good.
Okay. Okay, so as the states come online, we've been communicating with them regularly and trying to, work through any implementation kind of nitty-gritty issues with them. So I think we're getting good feedback from the states generally.
All right, thank you. So the next question says, please describe in more detail the differences between what can go to reverse distribution and versus which ones can go to reverse logistics.
So as we stated, reverse logistics, so is specifically for non-prescription pharmaceuticals, such as over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, could be supplements, as well as other non-prescription unsold retail items. And the reverse logistics is the policy that US EPA clarified in the Farm Rule regarding that as long as it's being used, reused, or reclaimed, they are not a solid waste at the healthcare facility or at the retail store. And the reverse distribution is specifically for prescription pharmaceuticals, which are being sent for verification for the manufacturer credit.
So I will add to what Victoria said. Everything she said was accurate. This is not a distinction that we came up with, right? It's a distinction that commenters asked us to make. We did not make that distinction clear in the proposed rule, and so in response to comments, we drew this distinction about reverse distribution as a terminology used for prescription pharmaceuticals. Reverse logistics is a terminology used basically for everything else.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go back to the question from Dana where she did specify the generator. So could you please explain again the accumulation storage time for hazardous waste RCRA pharmaceuticals for the generator?
For the generator, that's 1 year or less.
Okay. Hopefully that answers your question. We're going to move on to the next one. It says DTSC, this is a comment. DTSC should consider how subpart B will help the CUPAs better understand how to inspect healthcare facilities.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Thank you for that.
Okay, we'll go ahead and record that as well. Next one says, can you clarify if you stated that empty container regulations, if adopted, would apply to the RCRA waste containers, not just hazardous waste pharma?
It's only for containers that held a hazardous waste pharmaceutical.
Okay. Next one says, what's the difference between acute and non-acute? Sorry, I missed that.
So that's all specified in the regulations. So there's a list that EPA maintains, which has a listing of acute hazardous waste as well as a listing of non-acute hazardous waste. And then there's also characteristic criteria in the regulations as well.
So anything on the P list is an acute hazardous waste federally. I don't know how it works in California, but anything on the P list is an acute hazardous waste. There are some other acute hazardous waste, but they wouldn't be relevant to Pharmaceuticals Rule.
Yeah, it's the same in California. P listing would be acute.
All right, thank you. We're asking, someone's asking Victoria for you to repeat your explanation of other containers being considered empty, specifically with the aerosol explanation.
Oh, the other containers. Okay. So the RCRA empty standards are basically the same for other RCRA empty container or empty standards in general. But the only thing that I was making differentiation between, because the empty the other containers sometimes do have, for instance, like nebulizers or aerosol cans. So there's just an additional criteria for if it held a compressed gas. So it's just considered empty when the pressure of the container approaches atmospheric. And that's in the RCRA federal empty container regulations as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. Next question says, with respect to empty containers, would CA apply the federal definition of empty or change the adopted rule to match the existing California empty definition?
Well, we have the option. We'd like to match it as much to EPA as possible. Even though, California does have some differences. So as I said, the way that we apply some parts of the rule may be different in California than on the federal level. But at this point, we're looking at whether we can try to match it as much as possible to how EPA has promulgated the standards.
Okay, thank you.
One thing. But if you do want to make a comment or if you think that there may be an issue with that, or if you think that may be a good idea, let us know as well and provide us information on that.
Okay. Next one says, can you clarify if DEA, where in writing the DEA only allows combustion? This is not in the current DEA 2022 pharmacist manual.
They've said it publicly lots of times. I'm not sure if they've said it in writing, but based on their prior statements, we incorporated it into our conditional exemption that a hazardous waste that's a controlled substance has to be incinerated in order to meet the terms of our conditional exemption.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Next one says, what is the difference between non-acute RCRA hazardous waste and acute? I think we already answered that, correct?
Yes, we did.
Okay. The next one says, how can we verify if the reverse distributors are registered / credited with California?
What do you mean registered? When they send the form to EPA, they would be notifying that they're operating. Is that the question?
So I think they want to check if the reverse distributors are registered or credited in California. Was there a way for them to do that?
I'm not understanding. What do you mean registered or credited?
So registered is usually a term used by DEA. So a DEA, a reverse distributor, if they have any controlled substances on site, would have to be a registrant with DEA. Under EPA regs, they would have to notify using the 8700-12.
Okay, hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to put another one in there with more clarification. Next one says, if the generator is incinerating their DEA RCRA farm, do they need a RCRA permit?
The generator cannot incinerate them, no. Well, unless the generator also happens to have a permitted hazardous waste incinerator or HMWE or SISWE or MSW incinerator, which I don't think any healthcare facilities have those. So they've got to send them to a off-site permitted incinerator.
Perfect. Okay. Next one. Please clarify the last statement. DTSC only regulates RCRA pharmaceuticals. It says DTSC and the CUPAs also regulate non-RCRA pharmaceuticals. So they just want to clarify that statement.
No, if it is a pharmaceutical, which would be a non-RCRA hazardous waste, that would be regulated under the Medical Waste Management Act, which is the California Department of Public Health has authority over.
Okay. Next one says, DTSC website has a separate page on pharmaceuticals and personal care products. How does this play into discussions we're having about pharmaceuticals?
That page, we don't manage that page. That's actually, I think that's the Safer Consumer Products. So I can't really just speak on that page because I do not manage it. I guess you could contact whoever is in charge of that page if you have any other questions about it.
I think it's Safer Consumer Products as well, if I'm...
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Next question says, has DTSC partnered with California Hospital Association about the potential adoption?
No, I don't believe we have, but if they want to provide any comments or provide any feedback, they are welcome to. Or if you think that we should get in contact with anybody, if you could provide their information to us, we would appreciate that.
Great. So the next one says, how will P-listed hazardous pharmaceuticals be counted in subpart P? Does it count towards generator status?
No pharmaceuticals managed under subpart P count towards generator status.
So the benefit to that is that, right, once you're under subpart P, you're under subpart P and everything's the same, and you don't have to worry about whether you're, whether you're going over some, threshold, right? Once you're in subpart P, you're in subpart P, and you're regulated the same. There's no generator category for them, and you don't have to count them. So, there's, a lot of people will segregate their acute from their non-acute. Not that the regs actually require that, but a lot of people segregate their acute from their non-acute to make sure that they're under the 1 kilogram threshold. If you're operating under subpart P, you don't have to worry about that.
Okay. Thank you. Next one is a comment. It says, thank you again for the opportunity to provide comments on DTSC's consideration of the Pharma Waste Rule. CVS supports California's adoption of the rule in full. Included in benefits of the Pharma Rule is a more straightforward, tailored inspection process, which makes the process more accurate, efficient, and focused. It also results in reduced workload for inspectors. Thank you so much for that comment. We'll go ahead and record that one as well. So the next one is a question. It says, it says, are the potentially credited or credible pharmaceuticals logged at the HFC? If not, wouldn't there be an opportunity for diversion between the HCF and the reverse distributor if only the RD is logging what's received? So it's two parts. We'll start with, are the potentially credible pharmaceuticals logged at the HCF?
No, there's no requirement for the healthcare facility to log them.
Okay, so if not, wouldn't there be an opportunity for diversion between the HCF and the reverse distributors if only the RD is logging what's received?
Yeah, there is that potential. They're typically, sent through, UPS, FedEx, and so on. There haven't been reports, to my knowledge, of that being a big issue. There's a requirement for the reverse distributor to, there's a requirement for the reverse distributor to acknowledge that it received it, but it doesn't necessarily, there's not like a weigh-in thing. The DEA actually has that for some of their regulations, that, the weight that the healthcare facility registers at the shipment time has to match the weight that the incinerator has, but we don't have that same requirement that DEA has.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Next one says, for EPA, is there an inspection checklist for subpart P inspections in EPA non-delegated states?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
For EPA, is there an inspection checklist for a subpart P inspection in EPA non-delegated states?
We have not developed a checklist. I feel like one of the states or regions has. I can check and follow up on that.
Okay. And the next one looks like it's also for EPA. It says, is EPA aware of any problem with generators attempting to use FARMS code in lieu of the waste codes? We were advised by our TSDF that several of the hazardous waste incinerators would not accept waste packaged in this manner.
Yes, so in the comments that we received, the incinerators did not love that provision so healthcare facilities sending non-creditable pharmaceuticals to TSDF for incineration, we say that they don't have to put the hazardous waste codes on the manifest. They can put farm or farms code on there. The incinerators did not love that. So we allow the use of the waste codes, but we don't require the use of the waste codes. And if the TSDFs, in their contracts or other vendors in their contracts require, the transporters, for example, require those ID numbers, then that's their prerogative. They can do that. We don't require it, but they can.
Okay, and there is a comment that goes with the subpart P. It says the subpart P removal of DEA controlled substances from RCRA and sending to reverse distribution makes management of DEA disposal much more efficient solely under the 21 CFR DEA regulations. So thank you for that comment. We'll also record that one. Next question says, current Fed criteria for the RCRA empty container is no more than 3% by volume. DTSC's criteria is no pourable amount for liquid. Can you confirm this?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I would actually make an amendment to the EPA version, though. The EPA version, it's not only the 3%. There's an and in there. It has to be emptied by commonly employed methods and no more than 3% or 1 inch.
All right. Thank you for that clarification. Next question says, how does the Farms Rule dovetail with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act?
We have a discussion about that in the preamble to the final rule from 2019.
Okay. The next two are comments. I'm not sure what it's referring to, but it says that's incorrect. LEAs also regulate medical waste, and in some cases, CUPAs and LEAs.
Oh, yes. Thank you for clarifying that. I think when I made my statement, I meant just DTSC does not regulate medical waste, but the CUPAs, yes, may. Thank you.
All right, appreciate that clarification as well. Okay, so next question says, what would the default hazardous waste generator status if they only generate RCRA pharmaceuticals waste?
So the generator status, so if you're operating under subpart P, if you're a healthcare facility operating under subpart P for your pharmaceuticals, and that's the only waste you have, then you don't have a generator category because you don't have any other hazardous waste.
Okay, hopefully that answers the question, but please feel free to clarify if needed. Next one says, if we only have P, then are we automatically a small waste generator or are we generators at all?
You mean if you only have P listed hazardous waste, only have acute hazardous waste?
That's what I read from it, but feel free to clarify.
So under the federal regulations, in order for the subpart P to apply, you have to be above the VSQG threshold, which is above 1 kilogram of acute hazardous waste and or above 100 kilograms of non-acute hazardous waste. So once you're above that threshold, you're under subpart P for your pharmaceuticals.
Okay. Hopefully that answers your question, but again, you feel free to put another clarifying question in there. Moving on, the next one says, for sites that generate both RCRA and for sites that generate both RCRA hazardous farm and other RCRA hazardous waste, there would be 2 standards for the site to comply with, subpart P if adopted and California RCRA regulations. Do you agree?
So yes, only the RCRA hazardous waste pharmaceuticals would be subject to subpart P. Any other RCRA hazardous waste is subject to the other requirements in the hazardous waste regulations.
And if you have universal waste, those would be subject to different set of regulations. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Next one is Looks like a comment here. It says CVS has seen the comprehensive Subpart P checklist in Region 10 EPA inspections, and in many states have adopted the pharma rule, such as New Jersey, Florida, etc. So thank you so much for that comment. Again, we'll go ahead and record that one. And it looks like we do have another comment. This one says, thank you for the opportunity to provide comments. Costco operates in 33 of the 34 states and territories who have adopted Subpart P, and we are in support of the rule. It provides clear paths for managing potentially credible pharmaceuticals and pharmaceuticals hazardous waste. We enjoy the consistency between the state regulations, which LEP, which let us keep the program simple for our operators. Costco has not experienced any problem with the states that it has adopted, within the states that it has adopted. Subpart P provides a clear chain of custody path from pharmacies to return distributors for potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. It helps pharmacies lose less money while ensuring appropriate destructions by the reverse distributors. Thank you again for the opportunity to comment. Thank you so much for that. Again, we'll go ahead and record that comment. It looks like we have a clarifying comment. It says, the next one says, for clarification, if a prescription or over-the-counter pharmaceuticals that would otherwise be a RCRA hazardous waste if disposed, it is not a solid waste / hazardous waste if it has a reasonable expectation for credit by reverse distribution.
No, it's still a solid waste.
Yeah, all prescription pharmaceuticals going to reverse distributor, regardless of whether it gets credit or not, is considered a waste. And that's because none of the pharmaceuticals that go to reverse distributor are actually redistributed. They're all disposed of. It's the reverse, the over-the-counter ones that typically go through reverse logistics as opposed to reverse distribution. Those, if they have potential for use, reuse, or reclamation, would not be solid waste. So everything going to reverse distributor is a solid waste. Reverse logistics, not a solid waste if there's a reasonable expectation of use, reuse, or reclamation. If there's not a reasonable expectation of use, reuse, or reclamation at the reverse logistics facility, then it shouldn't go there. It should go directly to a waste management facility from the healthcare facility.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Okay, so we have a couple more questions here. It says, actually, this looks like another comment. Clean Earth supports California's adoption of the pharmaceutical rule. Both hazardous waste haulers and pharmacies would benefit from the ability for DEA waste to go for reverse waste to go for reverse distribution. Pharmacists would likely spend less time with the waste hauler processing controlled substance inventory, allowing pharmacists to spend more time dispensing, counseling patients, and giving immunizations. Thank you so much for that comment. We will be recording that one as well. Moving on, let's see, it says, this also looks like a comment. It says the hazardous waste farm will not be counted anymore to determine if the generator is small or large, even if there's another hazardous waste.
Yes and no. So the pharmaceuticals are counted in order to determine whether you're subject to Subpart P. Once you're in Subpart P, you don't have to count the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals because there is no generator category for them, right? There's only generator categories are only relevant to your other hazardous waste. But you do have to count them in order to determine whether you're subject to Subpart P. I don't know if California is going to have the same, since they don't have a VSQG category the way we do. I don't know if they're going to have that same, if all healthcare facilities are going to be subject to Subpart P, regardless of how much pharmaceuticals they generate. But we have a cutoff of 100 kilograms of non-acute and 1 kilogram of acute. If you go over either of those thresholds, you're under Subpart P. But if California doesn't have that VSQG category, then it might be different when they adopt.
So they're asking if you can clarify the federal VSG, if they can opt into the Subpart P.
If a healthcare facility is a VSQG, they can opt into Subpart P. all other healthcare facilities must operate under subpart P.
All right, thank you. Looks like this might be our last question. It says, will DTSC consider republishing some of the drug-specific clarifications/exemptions provided by EPA? Example, epinephrine salt and nitroglycerin.
Well, I believe you're saying that there are memos from EPA.
It says that it's asking if DTSC will consider republishing some of the drug-specific clarifications and exemptions provided by EPA.
Such as like memos that EPA has published? I'm thinking that's what they're asking.
We don't have regulations related to. We clarified in a memo that like epinephrine salts aren't PO 42. We don't have an exemption in our regulations that say that. We just clarified that in the memo. So I think that's what they're asking if California DTSC shares that interpretation.
Oh, I see. So one thing to keep in mind is that when EPA puts out memos, California, we go by what are in regulations. So sometimes EPA could put out a memo which may have an interpretation, but it doesn't necessarily have the same weight as the actual regulations in California. But looking at the memos, it's very good guidance, if that makes sense.
Okay. They did clarify at the bottom that there are some DTSC letters in response to US EPA memos.
Oh. And even, California does have their own letters as well. But everything obviously goes back to the regulations.
So speaking of California letters, the next one says California has letters that basically require you to count P listed waste container weights.
That is correct.
Okay. Okay, so it looks like we've got a couple more questions, but there's a clarification in here on subpart P. It says, so subpart P would provide relief to the healthcare sector.
Oh.
Not sure if that's a comment or a question. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next actually, it's a comment here. It says, Albertsons and Safeway is in support of the California adopting subpart P. We have noticed our hazardous waste volume has gone down at the store level in the states that adopted subpart P, and we opted in. We would expect a reduction in the number of LQGs by not having to count empty Wayfair container weights, which would put us more in line with our expected generator category. All right, thank you so much for that comment. Again, we will record that one as well. We do have a couple more questions here. Next one does say, which agency would be regulating the reverse distributors in California?
Oh, are you asking if it would be a CUPA or if it would be DTSC? What is that the question you're asking?
It's just asking which agency would regulate that, but she says correct.
Oh, that's a good question. Does anybody know? Because I'm not sure, because it is a new type of entity and it's not necessarily a permitted facility. Yeah, I'd have to get back to you on that.
Yannette, can you put your email address in the chat? And we'll try to get back to you by email on this question.
Yes.
Or sorry, not the chat, the Q&A. Okay, and next one says, what is the incentive for pharmaceuticals going to a reverse distributor if they're not allowed to reuse the materials?
So as we stated, the pharmaceuticals go to the reverse distributor so that they can facilitate the monetary manufacturer credit on behalf of the manufacturer pharmaceutical. So they're just, I guess, getting credited on whatever were unused or expired pharmaceuticals. So I think that's what you're asking. I'm thinking that would be their incentive.
Yeah, there's a lot of monetary value with those unused pharmaceuticals, those leftover pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities. Right, the manufacturers provide the credit but the manufacturers don't want to deal with the thousands of healthcare facilities that are out there. So this middleman reverse distributor grew up to kind of make that happen between the manufacturers and the healthcare facilities. They take it back physically, figure out how much is left, how much credit is attributed to those, and then the manufacturer actually provides the credit.
Okay. Next question says, will California DTSC allow VSQG to opt into Subpart B?
So we're still evaluating the rule, and we're looking at, as I stated before, we would like to adopt the rule as closely as possible to EPA. So we're looking at possibly adopting that as well.
All right, thank you. So the next one says, I think the CUPA would be the regulator if the RD is assuming responsibility RCRA farm and thereby becoming the generator.
Maybe.
Yeah, they're not really the generator. They're what we refer to as kind of a new hazardous waste management facility, right? So they're kind of a quasi TSDF, right? They're accepting hazardous waste from offsite like a TSDF would, but we didn't think it was necessary to require a permit for them.
So the follow-up on that says then that would be DTSC as the regulator.
Well, if you can send an email to retail@dtsc.ca.gov, because I'm just not completely sure. It's just to give you the best answer. So we appreciate if you could send an email. We could respond to that.
Arlene, did you have anything else to add to that? It looks like your hand is up.
Oh, sorry. No, I was, that was for an earlier question, but I think that was answered. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, it looks like this will conclude our Q&A. It'll conclude our Q&A as well as our meeting for today. If you think of any additional questions, once again, you can reach out to retail@dtsc.ca.gov for any clarifying questions or comments. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation. Oh, we do have one more question I can sneak in. Here we go. It says, are facilities subject to Subpart P allowed to consolidate this hazardous waste pharmaceutical?
There is a offsite consolidation provision in Subpart P that's very similar to the offsite consolidation provision that's in the new generator improvements rule, if that's what they're asking.
Okay, thank you. I'll give a second or two to see if there's any clarification on that one. Otherwise, that will be our last question for today. We want to thank you guys for joining us and providing your questions and comments. As I mentioned, please go ahead and email any additional questions or comments to retail@dtsc.ca.gov. So again, thank you for your interest and for participating today. Thank you again, everyone, and stay safe.